One evening in Venice in the late 19th century, Richard Wagner was being carried home on a gondola across the dark waters. His gondolier plied the oar when suddenly, from his mighty breast, came a mournful sound not unlike the howl of an animal. Swelling up from a deep, low note, it culminated in the simple musical phrase, Venezia. So Venice is the music, while the music lasts. Charles Burney remarked that the Venetian people seemed to converse in song. The gondoliers were notorious, if that is the word, for singing recitatives taken from the poetry of Tasso. Yet these were laments, because the sadness of Venice entered its song. Women, sitting on the seashore, would sing Tasso to their husbands fishing in the waters. The men would reply in song, setting up a conversation in music. There were popular songs known as vilotte, sung by the women as they sat sewing or preparing food. These were often laments of love, concerning hopes and dreams and desires. And of course, there were the famous Venetian serenades, sung beneath the ubiquitous balconies to the accompaniment of the mandolin or the guitar. The Venetians were infatuated with music. In 1581, a guidebook to Venice celebrated this city as La Sede di Musica, the seat of music. This was the harmonious community, with an unrivaled tradition of sacred and secular music. The ducal band played here in St. Mark's Square 1 hour every afternoon. Throughout the centuries, this great central square has resounded with music. There were other street bands, as well as concert halls and choirs. All of the sestieri echoed with the sound of voices and of instruments. On Good Friday, the members of each parish, the wine sellers, the fishermen, the gondoliers, would sing out the long chant of the 24 hours. This was nothing to do with church observance. It was the choice of the people themselves. Each guild had its own songs and melodies. There were popular choral societies. There were many academiae or private societies where amateur musicians performed. The inventories of middle-class Venetian households reveal the presence of string or keyboard instruments in most of them. Music is just as important in the 21st century. It is considered a rite of passage for visitors to Venice to stroll through the arcades surrounding the Piazza San Marco, once described as the greatest drawing room in Europe, and to take tea at Florian's or Quadri. The musicians at the restaurants in the square take it in turns to entertain their guests. Venice, music is part of daily life. Essentially, the beginning of the 16th century initiated the long period in which Venetian music took the palm. After the expansion of its empire was ended, it aspired to other forms of supremacy. It was the home of the madrigal, invented in the city. It was the center of church music. It was the capital of opera. There was scarcely a European composer of note who did not make his way to Venice. Scarlatti, Gluck, Mozart, Wagner, Handel, Mendelssohn, Monteverdi, Stravinsky all visited this most serene city. Wagner and Monteverdi died here. The music of Venice has a certain sweetness. It was often light and clear. In that sense, it could be suggested that it contains little interior life. There could be no Beethoven in Venice. It has an irresistible flow. It has the rhythm of the sea, not of the wheel. It provokes astonishment and admiration rather than contemplation. Yet it could also be unruly and abrupt, with sudden and unexpected turns, both in melody and in harmony. It is often eccentric or extravagant. It sometimes relishes strangeness, or what were known as bizarreria. It has an Eastern flavor. It favors contrast and intricacy. It can be fast and florid. It perfectly suits the genius of the virtuoso. Yet Venice would not be Venice without the smell of trade as well as the sound of music. The city became the capital of music publishing and of instrument making. The great Venetian composers can be seen as very successful men of business. And no one was more eager for commission and more avaricious for gain than that quintessentially Venetian artist and violinist, Antonio Vivaldi. He had the trading instinct in his blood. Vivaldi was born a Venetian in 1678 and was baptized in the parish church of San Giovanni in Bragora. His father, Giambattista Vivaldi, was a musician in the Cathedral of St. Mark's. It was there that Vivaldi himself began his training as a violinist. His father taught him the rudiments of what he must have considered to have been the family profession. This was the Venetian tradition. At the age of 15, he was received into the minor orders of the church, and 10 years later, he was ordained as a priest. He became known as the Prete Rosso, or red-headed priest, the red hair, perhaps, being an expression or indication of his fiery temperament. He had a prominent arched nose, pointed chin, and large, expressive eyes. He would have been familiar to the author Mickey White, who gave up a career photographing professional tennis players at Wimbledon and moved to Venice, where she devoted herself to researching his life and work. If you saw Vivaldi coming into this church, as he must have done, what would strike you first about him?
If you want to imagine and think what it was like in today's terms, what you've got to do is you've got to mix two people together, John McEnroe and John Lennon. McEnroe with the fiery temperament, the unconventionalist, the creativity. John Lennon, the musical flair, the fact that pushing back boundaries, musical boundaries all the time, and completely wacky. I often think that if you ask Vivaldi what he composed, probably the Four Seasons wouldn't occur to him at once. I would think that it would be his sacred music.
In 1704, at the age of 26, Vivaldi was appointed to the music school of the orphanage, the Ospedale della Pietà, and was music master there for most of his life. The orphan girls in the charitable institutions of the state were given an extensive and elaborate musical training, so that their concerts became the wonder of the age. These ospedali became, in essence, musical conservatories, where young girls learned how to sing, to play, and to compose new works. Mickey White immersed herself in the archives of the Curia, the church administration. She discovered the names of Vivaldi's star pupils and the music he wrote for them. And she attracted the attention of the Oxford choral scholar Richard Vendome.
How did you know where to look?
There are various documents, like the minute books of the Pietà, and then there are books like this and that one. And this is to do with all the holy orders. And here we find Vivaldi, here Antonio Figlio Giovanni Battista Vivaldi, and he was assigned to San Giovanni in Olio. He was ordained on the 23rd of March, 1703, by Giovanni Badoer, who was the Patriarch, and he was ordained at the Patriarch's Palace. Now, all this is written in Latin. You just have to go through all the names and find Vivaldi. You can trace the 10 years of his priesthood.
Inspired by new evidence unearthed in the archival records of Venice, Richard Vendome assembled an all-women choir to reproduce as faithfully as possible Vivaldi's sacred music.
First of all, we looked at Mickey White's research, and we discovered that indeed it was true that this music would have been performed with all women. We all enjoy it because it's a completely novel idea that there's this group of people who are all female. My role is almost on the sidelines, really. I sort of try to keep out of things because I don't like the idea of a man sort of interfering in a woman's world, because I think that's what there would have been at the Pietà in Vivaldi's day. Basically, although there were male governors, the internal management of the Pietà was essentially female, and certainly the musical management was female in terms of certainly what happened in the church. Perhaps in the concert hall, the maestri, who were male, would have had more of a role, but I believe in the church that as you looked up at the organ gallery, you wouldn't have seen a man, you would have seen women there. This is a performance entirely by women, directed by women. We then worked out how that was done, and we looked at the documents, and we saw what the women's names were and how they worked. tried to replicate that choir by doing some research into the nature of women's voices and then building that up into a group that we think replicates the sound that Vivaldi would have heard. Essentially, women were allowed into the coro, the performing musicians of the Pietà, from their mid-teens, and would stay there as long as they were really capable of working, in some cases until their old age, really, until their 70s and 80s.
The girls were situated in singing galleries enclosed by wrought iron grilles so that their voices and melodies might have come from unseen angelic powers. Individual girls had their own cabals of admirers. The fact that they were orphaned only contributed to their power. But they were not nuns. Young men came to the Ospedale with offers of marriage to those whose voices pleased them best. There was no sound of applause in the churches of these institutions, but instead the audiences wept and prayed. There are reports of men and women fainting at the intensity of sound. I cannot imagine anything, Rousseau wrote, so voluptuous, so touching as this music.
We're in the Ospedaletto, and this church is more or less exactly as the old church of the Pietà used to be. All the four Ospedale, all the girls sang behind the grills. Now, Vivaldi, I'm sure, would have come here, knowing Vivaldi, he would have come here to listen to the girls of the Ospedaletto sing. He would have wanted to know how they were and think, well, my lot are much better than these, and also just to see what sort of music that they were singing, how they were singing. You know how.
When Vivaldi joined the Pietà, he became a thorough master of all its music. He became teacher, director, and musician. 9 years later, he was appointed as the official composer of the Ospedale. During those years, his fame as a composer had increased and spread throughout Europe. The King of Denmark, Frederick IV, made an especial visit to the Ospedale to hear one of Vivaldi's oratorios. Vivaldi plunged himself into a relentless round of composition, administration, and direction. He was quixotic and impulsive, by all accounts surrendering himself to the moods of the moment. Like his music, he seems to have acquired some extraordinary internal energy from an unknown source of power. It was said by one English musician of the time, William Hayes, that